Greetings, dear listeners. The War of 1812 officially began when the United States declared war on the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and the dependencies thereof on June the 18th, 1812. On June the 4th, Congress voted 79 to 49 in favor of war. The vote received the support of most Democrat Republicans, President James Madison's party, and was opposed by all the members of the opposition Federalist Party, plus some disaffected Democrat Republicans. The Senate commenced debate on the declaration on June the 9th and considered such options as postponing hostilities, fighting a strictly naval war, and declaring war on both France and Britain. In the end, they rejected all of these ideas, and on June the 17th, voted in favor of the declaration by the narrow margin of 19 to 13. Opposition came largely from the Federalist Party, abetted again by a few disaffected Democrat Republicans. Neither of these political parties exist today. Simply put, the Federalists were the party of Washington and John Adams, while the Democrat Republicans were the party of Jefferson and James Madison. Today's Democrat and Republican parties are different political entities. The vote was held in response to the June 1st, 1812 war message from President Madison, which listed the following grievances. 1. The British practice of boarding American vessels, the U.S. being a neutral during the Napoleonic Wars, and impressing American seamen for service in the British Navy. 2. The Royal Navy's practice of violating American territorial waters. 3. The British blockade system. The British were ostensibly blockading French ports, but were seizing and confiscating American shipping on the high seas. 4. Madison's belief that American overtures to resolve these issues had been ignored and rebuffed by the British. He also said he had uncovered evidence of an English secret agent who had been employed since 1809 in attempts to subvert the U.S. government. And finally, number 5, that British agents operating from Canada were fomenting hostilities between Native American tribes and white settlers. Sources: The War of 1812, Conflict for a Continent by J.C.A. Stagg, and Precedents of War by Michael Beschloss. We live in a world of instant global communication, but this wasn't the case in 1812, where it took days, weeks, and sometimes months for people to learn of current events. We shall see how communication problems will plague both sides as the war progresses. The American declaration of war began a conflict which lasted from June the 18th, 1812 to February the 17th, 1815. 2 years, 7 months, 4 weeks, and 2 days. 4 weeks and 2 days. So how about we say 30 days? I make the total number of days as 974 days. But, dear listeners, you can check my math if you like. Source: Wikipedia, War of 1812. So, how did the belligerents break down? I have read in various sources the population of the U.S. variously estimated as from 6 to 8 million, with the population of the Canadas at 500,000. Interesting to me, the population of the UK was only 18 million, so the belligerents were more evenly matched than I had originally supposed. But Britannia ruled the waves. Again, according to Wikipedia, the U.S. Army had 7,000 men at the start of the war and 35,800 at the end. The U.S. Rangers consisted of 3,049 men, while the U.S. militia was 458,463. From information gleaned from Robert Malcolmson's A Very Brilliant Affair, The Battle of Queenston Heights, 1812, the U.S. Army had less than 10,000 regulars, while there were, theoretically, 700,000 militia on the various state rolls, while the British had 1,150 regulars in Upper Canada, now Ontario, again backed by 11,650 militia. Again, according to Wikipedia, the British Army, by contrast, had 5,200 regulars at the start of the war, but 48,160 regulars at war's end. These were backed by 4,000 militia. On the seas, again, according to Wikipedia, the Americans sailed 12 frigates, 14 other vessels, and 515 privateers. A privateer, a private ship commissioned to seize enemy vessels during wartime. In other words, legal pirates. By contrast, the British boasted 11 ships of the line, 34 frigates, and 52 other vessels. These were supported by 9 ships of the Provincial Marine, a sort of Great Lakes Coast Guard operated by the British. In terms of indigenous allies, Wikipedia says the Americans were supported by 125 members of the Choctaw tribe. Choctaw. Choctaw. While the British enjoyed the support of between 10 to 15,000 warriors. William Wood was a Canadian historian who lived from 1864 to 1947. In 1915, he wrote a book called The War with the United States, Volume 14 of the Chronicles of Canada. While it's a very old book, I like the way Wood breaks down the antagonists. Regarding the American Army, he says that while 56,000 troops were enrolled during the war, no American general was able to field 6,000 men in actual battle. In contrast, Wood says the British Army had only 4,000 effectives defending a huge area at the start of the war, but by 1814, these were joined by 16,000 veterans of the Napoleonic/Peninsula War. Wood lists the grand total of British soldiers who served in the war at 34,000. The British Army was augmented by 4,000 Canadian regulars. With casualties and replacements, some 6,000 men were to serve in the following regiments: the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, the New Brunswick Regiment, the Canadian Fencibles, the Royal Veterans, the Canadian Voltigeurs, and I apologize for any mispronunciation, and finally, the Glengarry Light Infantry. With regards to the U.S. Navy, Wood notes that Thomas Jefferson, president from 1801 to 1809, didn't want a navy and thought America could defend itself with smaller gunboats. As a result, they went to war without a single ship of the line. Wood says some 10,000 men served in the Navy, which enjoyed considerable success in spite of such limitations. By way of contrast, Wood says 30,000 British seamen served in the war, but while Britannia had the world's greatest navy, he believed it had grown stale after 20 years of continuous war with France and through enormous losses of manpower. Wood also believes the Americans to be better shipbuilders, which showed itself through a series of remarkable naval victories. However, Wood thinks that Native Americans / First Nations warriors were a negligible factor in the war, an opinion I strongly disagree with. Wood also believes the total number of warriors to have been no more than 5,000. Finally, according to Wood, the total number of combatants during the War of 1812 was 700,000. Getting confused, dear listeners, with all these numbers? Well, I'm confused, and I'm your narrator. Figures as to the strength of the opposing forces varies according to your source. If you have different figures, dear listener, please share them with us in the comments below. Bottom line, the Americans outnumbered the British and Canadians on land, while the British dominated the Americans at sea. Which is ironic, considering what actually happened, as we shall see. So, the U.S. declares war on the British Empire on June the 18th, 1812. Then what happened? On June 22nd occurred the first of a series of riots in Baltimore, Maryland, between supporters of the Democrat-Republicans, and thus supporters of the war, and the Federalist opposition. Alexander Conte Hansen, a Federalist serving in the Maryland House of Delegates, had launched a newspaper called the Federal Republic and Commercial Gazette, which was highly critical of the Democrat-Republicans. On the 22nd, an angry mob of government supporters attacked the newspaper offices, destroying the printing press and the entire building. One attacker died when he fell while knocking out an upper-story window. Hansen swore he would continue publishing. On June 23rd, the British government of Lord Liverpool repealed the Orders in Council, one of which allowed the boarding and searching of neutral shipping, a major cause for the American declaration of war. But it was too late. According to Wikipedia, it took 41 days, until July 29th, for news of the declaration of war to reach the British government, while Madison didn't learn of the removal of the orders until 50 days, until August 12th, 50 days after their repeal. As we shall see going forward, slow and poor communication will be a major factor in the war. I know, understatement of the year. On June the 23rd, a U.S. squadron led by the USS President, Commodore John Rogers, a 44-gun, 3-masted frigate launched in 1800, veteran of both the Quasi and Barbary Wars, attacked HMS Belvidera, a fifth-rate 36-gun frigate launched in 1809. After an engagement in which Rogers was wounded, his leg was broken, the Belvidera escaped and brought news of the war to Halifax, the principal British port in Canada. Source: the Wikipedia article on the USS President. On June 29th, 2 American schooners, the Sophia and the Island Packet, fleeing the St. Lawrence River towards Lake Ontario, were captured near the Thousand Islands and burned after their passengers and crew were allowed ashore. Source: 4gwar.wordpress.com, a site which actually covers the War of 1812 week by week. Now, while all this was going on, William Hull was on the march. Hull was a man of almost 60 years who had served with distinction during the Revolutionary War and who had also been governor of Michigan Territory since 1805. In early 1812, Hull was appointed Brigadier General in command of the Army of the Northwest, an appointment he accepted with reluctance. Hull took charge of 1,200 Ohio militiamen at Dayton on May the 25th. The 3 regiments of militia were commanded by Colonels Duncan MacArthur, Lewis Cass, CASS, and James Finley. This force was augmented by 300 regulars from the 4th Infantry Regiment, commanded by James Miller, which joined the force at Urbana, Ohio. The troops then began an epic 200-mile march through the wilderness to Detroit, which witnessed the army beginning to unravel, as documented in Pierre Berton's book, The Invasion of Canada. Hull's problems were compounded by unbelievably poor communications by Secretary of War William Eustis. When the bedraggled troops finally reached the Maumee River, Hull received a letter from Eustis, dated June 18th, advising him to hurry to Detroit, but neglecting to mention the simple fact that war had been declared. Source: Wikipedia article, William Hull. So, dear listeners, channeling my best Indy Nidell here, the first 12 days of the war conclude with a somewhat lukewarm declaration of war and action on both the high seas and the Great Lakes, and throughout Canada and the United States. Those people, and it sure isn't everybody, those people that know war has been declared wonder what will happen next. Welcome to 1812 Channel. July 1812. Canada invaded. Note: sources for the following information will be listed in the description for your enjoyment and edification. The barrage has finally lifted, so over the top we go. According to Pierre Berton in his The Invasion of Canada, Brigadier General William Hull, commander of the Army of the Northwest, finally learns of the American declaration of war against Great Britain on July the 2nd, 2 weeks late. On July the 2nd, while encamped near the Maumee River, which is near present-day Maumee, Ohio. After informing his officers and swearing them to secrecy, Hull sends a boat after the schooner Cuyahoga Packet, which had left the Maumee bound for Detroit, carrying 30 officers and men too ill to march. And Hull's personal and official correspondence. Treasure trove indeed. Hull is right to be worried. As the schooner passes Emmitsburg/Fort Malden, near the mouth of the Detroit River at Lake Erie, it is boarded by Provincial Marine Lieutenant Frederick Rolett, who captures the vessel. The British quickly realize the value of Hull's correspondence. As Pierre Berton says, it is, quote, a fine equal to the breaking of an enemy code, end of quote. The contents are quickly sent to Major General Isaac Brock in York, now Toronto, who instantly recognizes their value. While all this was going on, several jurisdictions announced their intention of sitting the war out. According to 4gwar.wordpress.com, on July the 2nd, Connecticut Governor Roger Griswold said his state's militia would not be serving in the war, while the very next day, July the 3rd, Pierre Berton says, quote, the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia issued a proclamation that his province and New Brunswick would abstain from predatory warfare against their neighbors. End of quote. On June the 26th, the Massachusetts legislature had already issued a statement in condemnation of the war. On July the 4th, a riot broke out in Montreal when the Governor-General of Canada, Sir George Prevost, attempted to conscript 2,000 men into the militia. When the protesters attempted to flee the area, they were followed by soldiers from the 49th Regiment, and shots were exchanged, killing 2 civilians. On scene, Sir George used his diplomatic skills to defuse the situation, pardoning the rioters with the exception of the ringleaders. As a result of his intervention, the French-Canadian majority in Lower Canada, i.e. Quebec, remained loyal to the British during the war. William Hull and his troops finally arrive in Detroit on July the 5th after what Pierre Burton describes as a 35-day struggle through the wilderness. In The Invasion of Canada, Burton describes their destination, Detroit, as a settlement of 1,200, mainly French-Canadian people, on the, quote, outskirts of a log fort, end of quote. Primarily hunters, the locals are unable to feed Hull's troops, leaving him reliant on a 200-mile supply line, skirting the waterways and vulnerable to attack from both the British and native warriors. On July the 12th, Hull finally crosses from Detroit, landing at Sandwich, now part of Windsor, Ontario, and he installs himself in the town's most palatial home, which belongs to an old and soon-to-be former friend, Lieutenant Colonel Francois Bobby. Shortly after arriving in Canada, Hull issues a proclamation to the inhabitants, claiming to have come in peace and asking them to remain aloof from hostilities. However, the proclamation also includes the lines, quote, "No white man found fighting by the side of an Indian will be taken prisoner. Instant destruction will be his lot." End of quote. Pierre Burton thinks these threatening lines stiffened the resolve of the local Canadian inhabitants to resist the invaders, as the Canadian militia would be found fighting with the native warriors, and, according to the proclamation, be subject to instant destruction. Instant destruction. Well, if they're going to kill you anyways, you might as well fight. But what do you think, dear listeners? Please share your thoughts about this in the comments below. On July the 16th, the Battle of the River Canard is duck in French, takes place partway between Sandwich and Fort Malden. It was more of a skirmish than an actual battle, and like so many engagements in this war, its results were largely inconclusive. It was also the first action of the War of 1812 in Canada. An American force of 280 men, under the command of Colonels Lewis Cass and James Miller, had been dispatched by General Hull to scout for the presence of British troops, and they encountered a British force of regulars from the 41st Foot, plus native warriors and Canadian militia, guarding the bridge over the River Canard. These troops were under the overall command of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Bligh St. George, commander at Fort Malden. Cass's men managed to flank the British, who retreated to Fort Malden. However, Hull, fearful of his troops' distance from the main American forces, ordered them back. 2 British regulars had been captured during the engagement, James Hancock and John Dean, Both had been wounded. Hancock died later in the day, while Dean had his left arm amputated. Hancock has erroneously been identified as the first British casualty of the war, but that dubious honor must go to some unknown seaman killed on July 23rd aboard HMS Belvedere during its encounter with USS President. However, Hancock was the first British soldier to die in the War of 1812 in Canada. Source: Burton. Skirmishing between the two sides at the Canard will continue until July the 25th, when a party of 117 Americans are ambushed by 22 Menominee warriors under Tomah. During the 3-hour fight, 6 Americans are killed, 2 are captured, while 1 Menominee warrior was killed. Fort Mackinaw, on Mackinaw Island, was a fur trading post on the Straits of Mackinaw, which divides Lakes Michigan and Huron. On July 17th, it was commanded by Lieutenant Porter Hanks, who led a mere 61 artillerymen. Hanks only learns of the outbreak of the war when the island was invaded by a combined force of around 600 men, consisting of British regulars, fur traders, voyageurs, and First Nations warriors, under the command of Captain Charles Roberts, a veteran British officer suffering badly from ill health. Meanwhile, at sea, the USS Constitution, a 44-gun frigate under the command of Captain Isaac Hull, nephew of General William Hull, encounters on July the 16th and 17th a British frigate accompanied by 4 or 5 other vessels. Hull, who is a chubby fellow like his uncle, but who is, unlike his uncle, a fighter, decides he's outnumbered in this instance and decides to leave. Alas, the wind wouldn't blow and the ship wouldn't go. Where's Carter when you need him? The wind wouldn't blow and the ship wouldn't go. So Hull decides using the Constitution's longboats to pull him out of the way. But the British employ the same trick to keep up the chase. Hull then resorts to kedging, which involves dropping an anchor or anchors at a point in front of the ship, then winding the capstan to draw the vessel forward to that position, to then repeat the whole laborious process over again. But after 60 hours of this, the wind finally picks up and Hull is able to make his getaway to fight another day. On July 19th, 5 vessels belonging to the Provincial Marine, a Canadian Coast Guard operated by the Royal Navy, appeared off Sackett's Harbor, the chief American shipbuilding yard, which was situated along the shore of Lake Ontario in Upper New York, west of Watertown. The British had captured an American merchant ship, but released her crew to take the following demands to shore: the surrender of USS Oneida and of the Lord Nelson, a British merchant ship the Americans had captured prior to the outbreak of war. The Oneida attempted to break out of the harbor, but returned when the British forces fired at it. When the British dropped anchor, the Oneida was turned so that 9 of its guns faced the enemy, the rest being taken ashore and placed on a breastwork near a 32-pound gun, which had been intended for the Oneida, but which had been found to be too heavy for the ship. The alarm was sounded to summon the local militia, but while some 3,000 had assembled by the end of the day, they were not a factor in the battle. The first shot was fired from the 32-pounder, but fell short, provoking raucous laughter from the British fleet. Hey, I like that. A war with a sense of humor. The British then returned the compliment. The shots from both sides had failed to inflict any casualties until a 24-pounder struck the stern of the British flagship, Royal George, raking her and killing 8 seamen. As the flagship had been badly damaged, the retreat was sounded, and the fleet returned to port in Kingston, Upper Canada, now Kingston, Ontario. July 28th. Isaac Brock, in his role as the Administrator of Upper Canada, addresses the legislature regarding the war. Brock, according to Pierre Burton, has little faith in either the loyalty of the population of Upper Canada, the majority of whom were actually born in the U.S., nor does he have any faith in their ability to fight effectively. Still, he lavishes them and their First Nations allies with praise. To stiffen resistance and to deal with potential traitors, Brock asked the legislators to suspend habeas corpus and to impose martial law, but they decline. But one thing Brock does do is to send Colonel Henry Proctor, a more energetic soldier, to replace Thomas Bly St. George at Fort Malden. Proctor arrives at Emmitsburg on July the 26th, and we will be hearing more of Proctor later. Whatever we know about Brock, he was a soldier, not a politician like Prevost. He longs to leave York in order to hurry to Fort Malden to confront William Hull. Will he make it? Stay tuned. August 1812. This month's roundup of the events of the War of 1812 will not feature the Battle of Detroit, if you can call what happened a battle. I'm going to make a separate video about the fall of Detroit, although this video will include some of the events leading up to the surrender. As the month opens, Brigadier General William Hull is living in the home of a now ex-friend, the Francois Bobby House, which is in Sandwich, Upper Canada, now part of Windsor, Ontario. The Francois Bobby House, where he spends his time dithering and quarreling with the officers under his command. On August the 2nd, Hull learns of the capture of Fort Mackinaw and freaks out, fearing the loss of the fort will lead to a native uprising. He will abandon his position in Canada and return to Detroit on August the 8th. On August 5th, Hull dispatches 200 troops under Major Thomas Van Horn to go to the River Raisin to pick up cattle and other supplies for the troops at Detroit. As they forded the Brownstown Creek, which is 15 miles south of Detroit, source, author Richard Felto, as they forded the Brownstown Creek in thick fog, this force was attacked by about 24 Native American warriors from various tribes, led by the Shawnee Tecumseh, Damie from the Chickamaugas, and Roundhead from the Wyandots. The result? Panic! Van Horn had ordered a retreat, but the raw militia troops scattered and ran, and thus became easy pickings. The Americans suffered 18 dead and 12 wounded, with 70 missing in action, although many of these eventually found their way back to Detroit. The warriors suffered only one casualty, a minor chief named Blue Jacket, not to be confused with the more famous chief Blue Jacket, war chief of the Shawnee and a forerunner of Tecumseh, or with the NHL team, the Columbus Blue Jackets either. The Blue Jackets are my team. Go Stinger! As noted above, Hull is hardly reassured and returns to Detroit on August the 8th. Unbeknownst to him, on the same day, although some sources give the date as August 9th, Hull's eastern counterpart, Major General Henry Dearborn, agrees to an armistice with his British counterpart, Sir George Prevost, Governor-General of Canada. The agreement stipulates that both sides confine themselves to strictly defensive operations, i.e., no attacking and no invading. The impetus for this arrangement occurred on August 1st, when Sir George learned the British Orders in Council, link in description, the British Orders in Council, the ostensible cause of the war, had been repealed, and that the British minister in Washington, Augustus John Foster, was hoping to open negotiations leading to peace. Source: The Astonishing General, The Life and Legacy of Sir Isaac Brock by Wesley B. Turner. Neither Dearborn nor Sir George seem especially anxious to go to war, but President Madison will reject this armistice, and hostilities will resume on September 4th. Fortunately for General Brock, this armistice doesn't apply to Detroit and the Western Theater, but Brock will later be frustrated by the armistice as it prevents him from attacking the American Fort Niagara, across from present-day Niagara-on-the-Lake, after his victory at Detroit. August 9th, another day, another skirmish. As the garrison at Detroit still needed the cattle and other supplies that the expedition under Major Van Horn failed to collect, Hull dispatches Lieutenant Colonel James Miller with a force of 280 regulars, 330 Ohio militia, and 60 Michigan legionnaires, mainly French Canadians, to escort the supply train to its destination. Near the Wyandotte village of Magwaga, now present-day Riverside, Michigan, the Americans were confronted by a combined force of 205, consisting of regulars from the British 41st Regiment, Canadian militia, and native warriors, all under the command of Captain Adam Muir. What followed was a confused engagement in which the bright uniforms of the 41st proved a real disadvantage. I found the following quote from early Canadian novelist John Richardson on the Wikipedia article about the skirmish. Richardson was a participant in the engagement as a gentleman volunteer to the 41st. Quote, "Here it was that we had an opportunity of perceiving the extreme disadvantage of opposing regular troops to the enemy in the woods. Accustomed to the use of the rifle from his infancy, and possessing the advantage of a dress which renders him almost undistinguishable to the eye of a European, the American marksman enters with comparative security into a contest with the English soldier, whose glaring habiliment and accoutrements are objects too conspicuous to be missed, while his utter ignorance of a mode of warfare in which courage and discipline are of no avail renders the struggle for mastery even more unequal." End of quote. Yeah, I know, the word is accoutrements. Accoutrements. Oh, to hell with it. That's close enough. As part of the confusion, some British soldiers mistook some Potawatomi warriors under Chief Main Pock, a.k.a. Crippled Hand, as American infiltrators and fired upon them. The warriors returned fire, resulting in a number of casualties among both groups. Further confusion occurred when Muir ordered the bugler of the 41st Light Company to sound the charge. According to the Wikipedia article, while light companies used bugles to convey orders, the rest of the infantry communicated via drummers. As a result, the order was not universally understood, and one company of the 41st thought the bugle was signaling retreat. And so they retreated, and the rest of the 41st soon followed. Miller gave chase, but halted once Muir was able to rally and form up his troops for battle. But Miller was content with his victory thus far. According to author Richard Felto, Muir had been seriously wounded, and so the British forces took their boats and crossed the Detroit River back to Fort Malden. Despite having cleared the line of communication and the line of supply, Miller remained halted for 2 days while torrential rains turned the trail into a quagmire. Various reasons have been suggested as to why Miller failed to advance. That he was seriously ill, that his men had lost their knapsacks during the engagement and were thus short of rations, that he had been shaken by the number of casualties he had sustained. But whatever the reason, he stayed put and was eventually ordered back to Detroit by Hull. Wikipedia lists the casualties sustained by both sides as American, 18 dead, 64 wounded. British, 6 dead, 21 wounded, 2 captured. According to Wikipedia, the Americans also claim to have taken 30 Native American scalps. But I don't believe that. No, I don't. No. So what's General Brock doing while all this is going on, eh? Well, as befits his energetic nature, he's hardly been idle. Note, the following timeline is based largely on information from The Astonishing General by Wesley B. Turner. On August 5th, Brock prorogues the legislature prior to his departure to the Western Front, i.e. Detroit and Fort Malden. On August 6th, Brock departs York for Burlington Bay with 100 men of the York militia, after stopping at a Mohawk village on the Grand River in order to secure the support of the native warriors. He reaches Port Dover on Lake Erie after a 250-mile march. On August 8th, Brock leaves Port Dover in a flotilla of small boats, taking with him a 6-pounder gun, 250 militia, and 50 regulars from the 41st. It was a rainy, miserable trip as the small boats battled high winds, which forced them to put in at Port Talbot on August the 11th. Brock will eventually arrive at Fort Malden in Emmitsburg on August the 13th, where he will have his famous meeting with the Shawnee War Chief Tecumseh, who supposedly turns to his followers and says of Brock, "This is a man." Brock calls a council of war, and plans are soon made for an attack on Detroit, which will be covered in a separate video. On August 14th, some sources say the 15th, a terrible incident occurs when, under orders from General Hull, Captain Nathan Heald attempts to evacuate Fort Dearborn in present-day Chicago. Their destination, Fort Miami on the Maumee River. Heald's party, which consists of regulars, militia, women and children, as well as 30 Miami allies, is ambushed by some 500 Potawatomi warriors led by Blackbird. In the ensuing melee, the Miamis flee, leaving the rest of the party to be massacred. According to Wikipedia, 26 regulars, 12 militia, 2 women, and 12 children are killed, while the rest of the party, 28 regulars, 7 women, and 6 children, are taken prisoner. Some of the prisoners will later escape or be ransomed by the British. Source: Wesley B. Turner. Both Heald and his wife survive, although both were wounded. On August the 19th, the USS Constitution, a 44-gun frigate, confronts HMS Gruyere. Gruyere, a 38-ton frigate about 400 miles southeast of Halifax, where the Gruyere is headed for a refit. Legend has it that during the early part of the action, a cannonball bounced off the Constitution's side, prompting a crewman to cry, "Hurrah! Her sides are made of iron." After exchanging cannon fire at half-pistol shot, i.e. extreme close range, Gruyere eventually loses both foremast and mainmast and is no longer able to maneuver. When asked if he was surrendering, the Guyere's captain, James Richard Dacres, said, according to Wikipedia, "Well, sir, I don't know. Our mizzenmast is gone. Our fore and mainmasts are gone. I think on the whole, you might say we have struck our flag." Now, if that ain't an example of British understatement, I don't know what is. When Dacres is escorted on board the Constitution, the American captain, Isaac Hull, who we met last month, refuses to accept the Englishman's sword, claiming he could not accept it from an adversary that had fought with so much gallantry. Hull had wanted to tow the Gruyere to port as a prize ship, but as it was too badly damaged, they evacuated the British crew and then set the vessel on fire, leading it to blow up. Dacres was quickly paroled and continued his naval career, rising to the rank of vice admiral. At the time of his engagement with the Constitution, Dacres was but 23 years old. Hull was 39. In his The Wars of America, Volume 1, author Robert Leckie relates the following incident. Old Ironsides, forward guns, double-shotted with grape, roared and flamed. They riddled Gruyere's rigging, ripped her sails, and reddened her decks with blood. Hull leaned over the rail, eager for a closer look, and split his tight buff trousers down the rear seam. His men shouted with laughter and bent to the guns. Hull was obviously an officer his men could get behind. Pun intended. And, it's great to see people having fun at work. The USS Constitution Museum offers a great breakdown as to the results of this engagement, as well as the results of many other 1812 battles. There's a link to it in the description. August 19th. The Great Louisiana Hurricane strikes New Orleans, damaging both the U.S. and British fleets. On the date in question, a great hurricane, on par with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, landed closer to New Orleans than any other hurricane on record. Historians have been able to reconstruct the path of the hurricane based partly on the logs of British vessels on blockade duty in the Gulf of Mexico. The hurricane made landfall on the 19th and caused extensive damage in the New Orleans area. Interestingly, Ohio, jumping off point for the American invaders, received extensive rainfall on August the 20th and 21st, no doubt an after effect of the great storm, and no doubt an added misery for the combatants. Weather will have a considerable impact on battlefield activity throughout this conflict. I put links to several articles about the Great Louisiana Hurricane of 1812 in the description for you to read if so inclined. Thus ends August, a month of skirmishing leading to the fall of Detroit, the disgrace of General Hall, and the triumph of the astonishing General Brock, a month that also sees action at sea complete with a hurricane. September 1812. The war thus far. On September the 1st, 1812, Major General Sir Isaac Brock is in York, soon to be on his way to first Kingston and then Fort George on the Niagara River. Always ready for offensive action, he finds himself stymied by the Armistice concluded by his boss, Sir George Prevost, and his American counterpart, Major General Henry Dearborn. The Armistice prohibits either side from attacking the other, but Brock suspects the Americans are using this ceasefire to build up their defenses and resources. And he's right. As for the disgraced William Hull, September 1st sees him in captivity, on his way to eventual imprisonment in the fortress of Quebec. The armistice is repudiated by President James Madison and Secretary of War William Eustis and will expire on September the 4th. On September 3rd, a small band of Shawnee, Delaware, and Potawatomi warriors attacked the hamlet of Pigeon Roost, named for the myriad passenger pigeons that nested in the area. The hamlet of Pigeon Roost, near present-day Scottsburg and Henryville, Indiana. 24 settlers, mainly children, are massacred, with 2 children kidnapped. Only 4 native warriors are killed. This attack appears to have been related to an attack on Fort Harrison, near present-day Terre Haute, Indiana, and the siege of Fort Wayne. Fort Madison, situated several miles north of the current city of Fort Madison, Iowa, had been under almost continuous attack by the Sauk, Fox, Winnebago, and Potawatomi warriors prior to the outbreak of the War of 1812. September 5th saw the beginning of a prolonged siege, which featured among its participants the famous Chief Blackhawk, who claimed at one point to have shot down the fort's flag. Kept at bay by musket and cannon fire by the fort's 50 defenders, the natives withdraw on September the 8th. According to Wikipedia, the action at Fort Madison was the only War of 1812 battle to take place west of the Mississippi. On the night of September the 4th/5th, Fort Harrison is besieged by a force of up to 600 Potawatomi, Way, Winnebago, Kickapoo, and Shawnee warriors. In command of the fort is future American President Zachary Taylor, with only 50 men under his command, half of them in sick bay. Early on, the warriors set fire to the section of the fort where the troops have stored their most essential staple, whiskey, which causes a massive explosion that destroys a 20-foot section of the fort's palisade. Now that's whiskey. Despite the destruction wrought by the fire, it helps the defenders as it lights up the attacking warriors, making them clear targets. When news of the siege reaches nearby Vincennes, some 60 miles away, a relief column of 1,000 men, including regulars from the 7th Infantry Regiment, is sent to the rescue. They will relieve the fort on September the 12th. The successful defense of Fort Harrison came to be seen as one of the first American victories of the war. A supply wagon following the relief column was attacked on September 13th in an area known as the Narrows, near present-day Fairbanks, Indiana, by a party of Potawatomi warriors. When the attack began, the horses bolted, and the warriors gave chase, allowing 2 men, John Black, wagoner, and Private Edward Purdue, to escape and make their way back to base at Fort Knox, which was near Vincennes, and which shouldn't be confused with the Fort Knox attacked by Goldfinger. However, the melee cost the Americans a wagon load of supplies, plus 11 dead, while the Potawatomi lost several warriors. A second supply column, unaware of the fate of the first, was attacked by the same warriors at the same spot on September the 15th. The Americans fled, abandoning the supply wagons, which may have saved them, but still 7 soldiers were killed, while another was badly wounded. Also on September 5th began the siege of Fort Wayne, when about 500 Potawatomi and Miami warriors, under Chiefs Winnemac and 5 Medals, and supported by British troops, attacked the fort, which is situated at present-day Fort Wayne. The garrison itself was only defended by 70 soldiers and civilians under Captain James Ray, who was a heavy drinker and, according to Wikipedia, retreated to his quarters. Command then devolved onto Indian agent Benjamin Stickney and Lieutenants Daniel Curtis and Philip Ostrander. The native warriors made several attacks on the fort, and Chief Winnemac even attempted to assassinate Agent Stickney as they awaited the arrival of British troops and light artillery from the Maumee River. In fact, rumor had it that 400 warriors under Tecumseh and 140 British regulars were marching to join the attack. An American relief expedition was quickly organized under William Henry Harrison, who had been appointed Major General of the Kentucky Militia. Harrison's force, which will number some 2,200 men, will arrive on September 12th, only to find that the enemy had departed. Well, let's shift our scene now to Upper Canada. In his book, The Call to Arms, the 1812 invasion of Upper Canada, author Richard Feltow describes a September 16th skirmish. Warren here. I meant, of course, skirmish. Skirmish. I had not encountered in any other source. He calls it the Battle of Matilda, which was the name of a nearby community. This action occurs when a British convoy of 33 boats traveling down the St. Lawrence River and bound for Kingston with supplies and passengers, which included the dependents of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, is attacked by American troops which had taken possession of Toussaint Island. Toussaint Island, pardon my French pronunciation, Toussaint Island, near present-day Cardinal, Ontario. The British land on Presqu'Île Island, which is so close to Toussaint Island, the American troops can fire upon them. But when the Americans attempt to storm the island, they are driven off, losing one boat which floats away downstream. Some 300 Canadian militia quickly join the fray, and the Americans are compelled to retreat to their own side of the St. Lawrence. Feltow is unable to provide exact casualty figures for this engagement. Interestingly, the Wikipedia article on the Battle of Matilda paints a somewhat different picture of the encounter. Find a link to it in the description. On September 21st, the Americans once again invaded Canada when a force of 110 regulars and militia under Captain Benjamin Forsyth left Ogdensburg, New York, by boat, departing on the 18th and arriving at their destination, Gananoque, Upper Canada, on the 21st. Gananoque was the main base of the Provincial Marine, and the main purpose of the raid, for it was a raid, not invasion, was the capture of ammunition and stores badly needed by the Americans. The raiders landed 2 miles west of Gananoque and marched on the town, where they encountered a defense force of around 100 members of the 2nd Regiment Leeds Militia under the command of Colonel Joel Stone and Lieutenant Levi Soper, S-O-P-E-R, Soper. After a short engagement, the militia were driven from the field, and the Americans entered the town, where they captured 3,000 rounds of ammunition and 41 muskets, as well as ransacking the local storehouse and destroying 150 barrels of provisions, before heading back to their boats and heading for home. In fact, they were gone in 30 minutes. The Americans suffered 1 dead and 10 wounded, while local casualties were 8 killed, 8 taken prisoner, and a number of wounded, including Colonel Stone's wife, who was shot in the hip. And to add insult to injury, the Americans also destroyed Stone's house. Stone himself was away at the time of the raid, escorting a convoy to nearby Kingston. He will die of old age in Gananoque in 1833, whilst Captain Forsyth will die in action at Odelstown in June 1814. Meanwhile, down on the Niagara frontier, there is trouble in paradise. Isaac Brock is chomping at the bit to go on the offensive, but his American counterpart, Stephen Van Rensselaer, commander since July 13th of the Army of the Center, lives in a state of alarm that his British counterpart will seize the initiative and attack. Even the arrival of 1,600 American regulars under Brigadier General Alexander Smythe only compounds Van Rensselaer's worries, as Smith refuses to obey any of his orders and even to meet with his commanding officer. But following the debacle at Detroit, the Madison administration wants an offensive. So stay tuned. October should be an interesting month. October 1812. The war thus far. On October 7th, an army commanded by Brigadier General James Winchester arrives at Fort Defiance, which was situated at the convergence of the Auglaize and Maumee rivers, the location of present-day Defiance, Ohio. Winchester was supposed to command the Army of the Northwest, but was pushed aside when William Henry Harrison was made a major general of the Kentucky militia. At the time of reaching the fort, Winchester was in command of one wing of Harrison's forces. If Pierre Burton is correct in his observations, and I have no reason to doubt him, Winchester is extremely unpopular with the troops, especially with the militia, which will eventually have disastrous results. According to Burton, Winchester considers resigning upon learning of his replacement by Harrison, but decides to serve on. I think his first idea was the best one. On October the 9th, U.S. Naval Lieutenant Jesse Elliott and Army Captain Nathan Towson, T-O-W-S-O-N, both natives of Maryland, captured the British brigs HMS Caledonia and HMS Detroit, which had formerly been the USS Adams and was captured at Detroit. Captured the British brigs HMS Caledonia and HMS Detroit as they lay at anchor near Fort Erie along the Niagara River. The Caledonia, with a load of furs, pork destined for Fort Malden in Emmitsburg, and some American POWs, escapes to the American side and will be renamed the USS Caledonia. But the Detroit is swept down the Niagara River and becomes a target for British artillery firing from the shore. Elliott fights back until out of ammunition, and the ship will run aground on Squaw Island, now known as Unity Island. Elliott flees back to the American side, while the Detroit is destroyed by artillery, both British and American. Note. This is in capital letters, so it's an important note. Note. In The Invasion of Canada, Pierre Burton paints a very different picture of this engagement, so you might want to check it out. I'm so intrigued. I plan to make a more detailed video about this skirmish at some future point. Richard Felto's book, The Call to Arms, The 1812 Invasion of Upper Canada, also provides a detailed account of the raid. On October 13th, the Battle of Queenston Heights takes place. It is one of the major battles of the War of 1812 and will be covered in a separate video when I review Robert Malcolmson's book, A Very Brilliant Affair. I only have to finish reading it first. On October 18th, USS Wasp, an American sloop of war, intercepts a convoy of 6 merchant vessels bound for Britain and escorted by HMS Frolic. As the main armament of both vessels were short-range carronades, short smoothbore cannons used as short-range anti-ship and anti-personnel weapons, the ships closed to within 60 yards and opened fire at 11:30 a.m. The Wasp fired low at the Frolic's side, while the Frolic fired high to destroy the Americans' rigging. After 22 minutes of slugging it out, the Frolic had massive casualties. When the Americans eventually boarded, they found 90 men, including every officer, had been killed or wounded. The Wasp had hoped to claim Frolic, at least what was left of it, as a prize, only to be captured in turn. In the end, Frolic was broken up in November 1813, while the Wasp was taken into British service and eventually renamed HMS Peacock. On October 25th, the USS United States, one of the U.S. Navy's 6 original frigates, confronts HMS Macedonian, bound for the West Indies, 500 miles south of the Azores. The United States boasted 55 guns, the primary weapon being 32 24-pounders. By way of contrast, the Macedonian had only 49 guns, which included 28 18-pounders. This was her first naval action. According to Wikipedia, the United States could fire 864 pounds of shot against the Macedonians' 528 pounds. I don't like them odds. The American ship, commanded by Stephen Decatur, began the action at long range, taking advantage of the longer range of his 24-pounders over at the British ship's 18-pounders. His first volley was inaccurate, with the British response bringing down a small spar on the American vessel. The Americans' next broadside left the British vessel largely dead in the water. By noon, the Macedonian was, in the words of Wikipedia, a dismasted hulk, and British Captain John Sermon Carden was forced to strike his colors and surrender, having suffered some 104 casualties. The United States had apparently fired 70 broadsides to the Macedonian's 30. The Macedonian was repaired and was sailed back to the United States as a prize, arriving at Newport, Rhode Island on December the 4th. The Macedonian would eventually be purchased by the U.S. Navy and have a long career as the USS Macedonian. The USS Constitution Museum website provides a useful recap of this engagement and other War of 1812 battles on both land and sea. There's a link to it in the description. The USS Constitution Museum provides the following statistics regarding the engagement between the United States and the Macedonian. Number engaged: Macedonian, 301 seamen, 49 guns. United States, 428 seamen, 55 guns. Casualties: Macedonian, 36 dead, 68 wounded. United States, 5 dead, 7 wounded. On October 28th, William Henry Harrison writes U.S. Secretary of War William Eustis to request permission to launch a campaign against towns belonging to the Miami tribe along the Mississinewa River. The Mississinewa River in Indiana Territory. He has heard rumors the Miamis have been inciting the Delawares to join them in fighting the United States. Eustis will respond on November 5th, basically telling Harrison to use his own judgment, which means attack! Around the same time, according to 4g.wordpress.com, Commodore John Shaw, commander of U.S. forces at New Orleans, writes Navy Secretary Paul Hamilton to complain he doesn't have enough resources to defend the port against either pirates or the Royal Navy. Little does he know that them pirates might come in handy someday. And meanwhile, over in Russia, Napoleon begins his disastrous retreat from Moscow on October the 19th. Thus ends a month of action at sea, as well as one of the pivotal land battles of the war, the Battle of Queenston Heights, which will be covered in a separate video when I review Robert Malcolmson's book, A Very Brilliant Affair. November 1812, a quiet month of the War of 1812. November 1812. Perhaps the biggest news of the month was the re-election of President James Madison. However, Madison's margin of victory over his opponent, a dissident fellow Democratic Republican, DeWitt Clinton, was much narrower than his margin of victory in 1808. Madison received 128 electoral votes to Clinton's 89, the results indicative of the considerable opposition to the war throughout the U.S. By way of contrast, in 1808, Madison beat his opponent, Federalist Charles C. Pinckney, by 122 to 47 electoral votes. HMS Royal George was a 20-gun sloop operated by the British Provincial Marine, later by the Royal Navy, on Lake Ontario during the War of 1812. It was the flagship of the Provincial Marine. On October 1st, the Royal George, under command of Hugh Earl and crewed by 50 members of the Provincial Marine and 64 men of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, anchored off the Genesee River, to raid the port of Charlotte, New York, which is now a suburb of Rochester, New York. They captured the dismantled sloop Lady Murray and a revenue cutter, returning the next day to demand the riggings and masts, M-A-S-T-S, of the Lady Murray. Talk about nerve. It was the Provincial Marines' sole victory during the war. Fast forward to November 9th, when the Royal George is surprised near Lake Ontario's Bay of Quinte, at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, by a small fleet of 7 American ships under command of Commodore Isaac Chauncey. The Royal George slips into the channel between the mainland and Amherst Island, and under cover of darkness makes her way safely home to Kingston Harbor. The next day, November 10th, the American fleet attacked Kingston Harbor in an attempt to capture the Royal George, burning a small commercial vessel during their approach. Batteries along the shore fired at the Americans, who returned the compliment, peppering the town of Kingston with round shot, but they were unable to capture the Royal George, which moved further into the harbor. Chauncey determined to try his luck again on the 11th, but an approaching November storm forced him to return to base at Sackett's Harbor. This was the only attack on Kingston during the War of 1812. Following a series of massacres in the Old Northwest, a punitive expedition was sent into Illinois Territory under the command of Major General Samuel Hopkins and Colonel William Russell of the 7th Infantry Regiment. On November 11th, a force under Hopkins' command, consisting of 3 regiments of Kentucky infantry, a company of regulars from the 7th Infantry under Major Zachary Taylor, plus some Indiana Rangers and some scouts, leave Vincennes, Indiana, on a punitive expedition against the Kickapoo, Winnebago, and Shawnee tribes. Reaching the site of the Battle of Tippecanoe, which had taken place on November the 7th, 1811, they discovered that the remains of some American soldiers killed in the battle had been dug up and scalped. On November 19th, the Army reached Prophetstown, which had been destroyed during the Battle of Tippecanoe, but had been partially rebuilt. Well, they destroyed it again. After destroying another nearby Winnebago village on Wildcat Creek, a scouting party was exploring the creek on November 21st when they were fired upon and fled, leaving behind the body of a dead soldier apparently named Dunn. The next day, November 22nd, a body of 60 Indiana Rangers was dispatched to retrieve their comrade's body. But what they found was Dunn's head on a pole, next to which stood a native warrior who taunted them. An unlucky 13 Rangers chased the taunting warrior, who led them into an ambush, where they were massacred. A traitor named Benoit Bessayon was captured, but then burned at the stake, where a friend put him out of his misery by shooting him, while one of those who escaped kept spurring his horse to go faster, which gave this engagement its historic name, Spur's Defeat. It is also known as the Battle of Wildcat Creek. American losses were 17 dead, 3 wounded, and Hopkins resigned. Wikipedia states that on November 23rd, the Americans withdrew from eastern Canada. Funny, I didn't know they were there. Unless they are referring to the Battle of La Colle Mills, which I learned of from the 4G War at WordPress site. Under the urging of President Madison, Major General Henry Dearborn assembled an invasion force of between 5,000 to 6,000 men, arriving at Plattsburgh, New York, November the 10th, with the goal of crossing the nearby Canadian border to seize Montreal. Dearborn is not known for moving quickly, so it is not until November the 20th that he dispatches an advance party under Colonel Zebulon Pike. Zebulon Pike, discoverer of Pike's Peak, to seize a Canadian blockhouse at La Colle Mills. Pike's men drive off the 40 defenders, but are mistakenly attacked by an American militia unit, which thinks it is attacking the British defenders. While all this is going on, British Major Charles de Salaberry, a Francophone, organizes a counterattack and drives the Americans back across the border. No wonder they withdrew on November 23rd. As for de Salaberry, we will hear about him again. After the defeat at Queenston Heights and the resignation of Stephen von Rensselaer, Alexander Smythe, a brigadier general in the U.S. Army, assumed overall command. Smythe has gone down in history as something of a horse's ass. As an officer in the regular army, he refused to serve under Van Rensselaer or even talk to him face to face, which contributed to the American defeat at Queenston Heights. Smythe thought he knew better and will now show he didn't. After releasing some rather bombastic proclamations, Smith fiddled while a number of buildings on both sides of the Niagara River burned following an artillery duel across the Niagara River on November the 20th. At the American Fort Niagara, one of the gunners was Mrs. Fanny Doyle, whose husband, Andrew, a private in the 1st Artillery Regiment, had been captured at Queenston Heights. According to author Richard Feltow, Mrs. Doyle came, quote, under heavy fire as she helped to load and fire a 6-pounder cannon that was mounted on the fort's mess house roof. End of quote. The offensive of the offensive general began during the early morning hours of November the 28th. Captain William King of the U.S. 13th Infantry Regiment led 150 soldiers from the 12th and 13th Regiments, augmented by 70 sailors under Lieutenant Samuel Angus. Objective: to destroy the battery at the Red House near Fort Erie, so that later the main U.S. invading force wouldn't have to face artillery. A second force of 200 men from the U.S. 14th Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Borsler crossed the Niagara River with the objective of destroying a bridge over Frenchman's Creek between Chippewa and Fort Erie, which would hinder the movement of British troops and prevent a counterattack against Smythe's main landing force. It was a good plan. It was. On paper. King's force landed under fire from the British defenders, men of the 49th Regiment under Lieutenant Thomas Lamont. The Americans were repulsed 3 times, but managed to outflank the British on their 4th attempt, capturing Lamont and dispersing his men. The attackers then spiked the British guns, set fire to the Red House, and returned to their boats. Unfortunately for the Americans, they became befuddled in the darkness of the moonless night and ended up splitting into two groups. The first group, led by Lieutenant Angus, reached the landing place and, assuming the king's men had already departed, took all the boats and left, leaving the second party, under Captain King, stranded on the Canadian shore. Finding and liberating two British boats, King sent half his men, plus his British prisoners, back across the river, but was himself captured, along with 30 of his men. Crossing the river, Borsler managed to lose 4 of his 11 boats, but was still able to land, opposed by 37 men of the 49th, under Lieutenant J. Bartley, after driving off the men of the 49th, as well as militiamen from the Norfolk Militia. The Americans took possession of the bridge, only to find they had a problem. The tools they were to use in destroying the bridge were all in the 4 lost boats. Borsler dispatched Lieutenant John Waring and 8 men to wreck the bridge by hand. They managed to rip up 1/3 of the planking before Borsler heard that the British were coming. The British were coming from Fort Erie, and shuffled off to Buffalo, leaving Waring and his men stranded. According to Wikipedia, when General Smythe heard of the spikings of the guns at the Red House, he exclaimed, "Huzzah! Canada is ours! Canada is ours! Canada is ours! This will be a glorious day for the United States." Smythe then ordered a force of 350 men of the 14th Regiment under Colonel William H. Winder to evacuate Captain King and his men. Collecting Lieutenant Waring and his men, Winder landed, only to beat a hasty retreat when confronted by a force of 300 men under Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Bishop. Coming under fire from the British, Winder's force took some 28 casualties as they rode for home. The Wikipedia article on this engagement suggests the raid had achieved its objective in spiking the guns at the Red House, as an American force could now invade between Chippewa and Fort Erie without coming under artillery fire. But if this was a victory, it was a hollow triumph. With the British and Canadian forces on high alert, Smythe attempts to launch an invasion next day, November 29th, in a cold, steady rain, but managed to load only 1,200 of his 3,000-man force into boats before calling it off. Smythe tries again on the 30th, planning a night attack, but dawn catches them still loading. So, rather than risk a daylight amphibious assault, Smythe calls the invasion off. Again! With his army on the verge of mutiny and his life in danger, Smythe returns home to Virginia, and 3 months later, his name is quietly dropped from U.S. Army rolls. Wikipedia lists the casualties of the engagement as follows: British and Canadian, 13 killed, 44 wounded, 34 captured. American, 24 killed, 55 wounded, 39 captured. However, Richard Feltoe in A Call to Arms, the 1812 invasion of Upper Canada, gives different casualty figures for both sides. He estimates the American dead at between 30 to 100. Thus ends the quiet month of November 1812, a month that sees action on Lake Ontario, massacre in the Old Northwest, and 2 attempted invasions of Canada. It also sees the re-election of President James Madison, that most unlikely of warmongers, albeit by a narrower margin, which reflects the country's divided support for the war, which isn't going well. The War of 1812. The war thus far. December 1812. A quiet month in the war? Maybe. On December 3rd, William Eustis resigns as Secretary of War, which saves President James Madison from having to fire him. Eustis might be referred to as Secretary of War useless, but it is not my intention to pour abuse on his ineffectual head. Eustis, who was a medical doctor and a Revolutionary War veteran, was clearly the wrong man for the job and had been picked for being a moderate Democratic Republican in Federalist New England, not for his military or administrative skills. After his appointment as Secretary of War in 1809, Eustis did try to improve the Army's training through updating their field manuals, but he failed to make improvements to the organization's management and logistics. In fact, the Army had no overall commander, which is why they ended up with the likes of William Hull and Henry Dearborn. Eustis's replacement will be the ambitious James Monroe, a future president who plans to serve as both Secretary of State and Secretary of War, an idea the Senate doesn't like. Monroe, who hasn't found his doctrine yet, will serve as the war minister until replaced by Brigadier General John Armstrong. On December the 18th occurs the Battle of Mississinewa. The Battle of Mississinewa, a conflict I had never heard of prior to undertaking this project. It was the result of another punitive expedition ordered by William Henry Harrison against the Miami tribe for attacks against Fort Wayne and Fort Harrison. Haven't we seen or heard of something like this before? If you don't know what I'm talking about, please check out my November 1812 video for the details of the Battle of Wild Cat Creek, aka Spur's defeat. On December 14th, a force of 600 mounted troops under Lieutenant Colonel John B. Campbell leave Fort Greenville with the objective of destroying Miami villages situated along the Mississinewa River. At the same time, Campbell was ordered to avoid inflicting any unnecessary harm on friendly Native Americans. Yeah, right. After marching 80 miles or 130 kilometers, the troops arrived at a Lenape village under Chief Silverheels, not to be confused with Jay, on December 17th, and take 42 prisoners. The force then proceeded to attack 2 Miami villages, killing many and taking 76 prisoners, including 34 women and children. Mission accomplished, Campbell decided to return to Fort Greenville, as some of his men were suffering from frostbite in the rigorous winter weather. Returning to Silverheels village on December 18th, Campbell's men were attacked by a large force of Native Americans attempting to free the prisoners. Despite being outnumbered, the native warriors fought hard and were only pushed back by a cavalry charge led by Major James McDowell. Losses: American, 8 dead, 48 wounded, 4 eventually dying of their wounds. Native Americans: 8 killed December 17th, 30 killed December 18th. 42 natives were taken prisoner, including 34 women and children. Learning that Tecumseh and a large band of warriors were coming to the rescue, Campbell led his force back to Fort Greenville, and according to 4gwar.wordpress.com, quote, fearing another Indian attack, Campbell's troops built a fortified camp every night during the 6-day retreat back to Ohio, depleting the men's energy even further. One day out from Fort Greenville, with all food gone, half the force suffering from the cold, and many of the wounded near death, the force is met by a relief column. Campbell's force reaches the fort on December 24th. More than half of his men are incapacitated by frostbite. End of quote. Both sides would claim victory. The Miami, as they had forced Campbell to return to Fort Greenville, and the Americans due to the number of prisoners taken. Harrison will order another expedition against the Mississinewa villages in July 1813, but by then the Miami will have fled. Today, the Battle of Mississinewa is commemorated each October with the largest War of 1812 reenactment held in the United States. On December the 26th, Boxing Day, Great Britain's Royal Navy begins a blockade of both Chesapeake and Delaware Bays, beginning a campaign of raiding and harassment, which will eventually lead to the burning of Washington, D.C. in 1814. December 29th witnesses 2 naval events. USS Constitution encounters HMS Java off the coast of Brazil. The Java was actually a captured French ship, the Renommee. The Renommee, Renommee, which had been built in 1805. Wikipedia describes it, quote, as a 40-gun Palais-class French Navy frigate, but the vessel actually carried 46 guns. End of quote. During the encounter, the Java, which had less firepower and a less experienced crew, many of them new recruits, was outgunned by the much heavier Constitution under the command of Commodore William Bainbridge. The captain of the Java, James Lambert, was killed by a sharpshooter, and command devolved onto Lieutenant Henry Ducey Chads. Henry Ducey Chads, who, owing to the damaged state of the Java, had no choice but to surrender his ship. British casualties were 22 dead, including Captain Lambert, and 102 wounded. The Americans had 9 dead, plus 57 wounded, including Commodore Bainbridge. Several of the wounded would later die. As the Constitution's helm, aka steering wheel, had been shot away, Bainbridge replaced it with the Java's. But the Java being too badly damaged to be taken as a prize, Bainbridge had it set on fire on New Year's Day, 1813, and it blew up. Talk about New Year's fireworks. The same day as this naval action, Paul Hamilton, America's 3rd Secretary of the Navy, a post he has held since 1809, resigns. Wikipedia states that while Hamilton was a proponent of improving and expanding the Navy, he found, quote, Congress hostile and the President indifferent to his ideas. End of quote. A statement which I have read in a number of other sources. According to historian J.C.A. Stagg, Hamilton is also beset by personal problems. He will be replaced by William Jones, a Philadelphia merchant with a greater handle on maritime affairs. Meanwhile, the army under William Henry Harrison is on its way through the snows to Fort Detroit. Is another invasion of Canada in the works? Only time will tell. Stay tuned. If this is your first visit to 1812 channel, my name is Warren, and I'm your host. I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the War of 1812. Instead, I'm a student wishing to learn about the conflict. Each month, for the roughly 3 years of the war, I will outline the major events, and I will also review a book on the war. Did I miss anything today? Any errors? Then let me know in the comments below. And when the barrage lifts, cheers. Cheers. Thought I had an echo there. Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pxhere, that's Pxhere, and they show some 1812 Ohio militiamen and several shots of the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides. The music today is the Pyre, by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod. I chose it as it had given me an earworm, and I hope it gives you one too. Thank you for listening.